In this fifth video dedicated to the Vertex Animation Baker tool, I'm going to go over a few tips and details, nothing tied to a specific use case though. For the most part, the tool is fairly straightforward to use. However, since it offers a wide range of features, it can still feel a bit overwhelming at times, and you might have questions about how certain things work. The wiki does a decent job of explaining everything, I think, but I still believe video demonstrations offer some added value. So, in no particular order, here are a few things to keep in mind. So far, I've demonstrated baking a single animated mesh, but the tool also supports baking multiple objects, with a few caveats worth mentioning. Here I have the same mesh, but split into several individual objects. They are skinned to the armature just like before. They are simply separate objects. Baking works just fine in this case, with no issues. However, problems can arise when baking multiple objects that don't share the same NLA track. For example, let's say one object has two NLA strips, and another object has two different NLA strips. That's perfectly valid, and you can still bake them into Vertex animation textures without issue. But there are a couple of important things to keep in mind. When using frame stepping, baking every nth frame, the stepping can be applied in two ways. Globally, across the entire animation sequence, skipping every nth frame, but also per NLA clip, ensuring that the first frame of each clip is always included, and then skipping subsequent frames according to the step value. This, I believe, can give more predictable results, unless, and that's my point, you're baking multiple objects with different NLA tracks. In that case, the per clip method can't be applied. You can still use global stepping, which is likely what you'd want in this scenario anyway. After all, you won't be able to use a state machine to selectively place specific clips on specific objects. The animation sequence will be baked exactly as it appears in the NLA editor, meaning with overlapping clips. One more word about frame stepping. When you skip every nth frame, you're effectively removing frames from the animation, right? Thus, if you play back the baked animation at the original frame rate, it will play faster. Twice as fast if you bake every second frame and so on. So you'll need to adjust the playback frame rate accordingly to maintain the correct animation speed. Another limitation when baking multiple objects involves retargeting animations to a low-resolution mesh. A high-res mesh can only target a single low-res mesh, and a low-res mesh can only be the target of a single high-res mesh. So each high-res object can target its own low-res object, and that works fine. But if you're trying to bake a high-res mesh made of multiple objects onto a single low-res mesh, like here, that won't work. You'll need to merge your high-res objects into one single mesh first. What else? If for any reason you need the texture resolution to be a power of 2, that can be enforced. However, this may introduce side effects. There are two scenarios. In the first case, the vertex count is lower than the enforced texture width. This leads to padding with blank pixels and wasted texture space. Not a deal breaker in itself, but it's something to keep in mind. In the second case, the vertex count is greater than the enforced texture width, which might happen anyway if the vertex count exceeds the maximum texture width. As explained earlier, the data then needs to be spread across multiple rows, and there are different ways to handle this. The continuous method is experimental. In theory, it can result in a more tightly packed layout and a smaller texture resolution, whether the vertex count is lower or higher than the enforced texture width. However, it's prone to precision issues and hasn't been thoroughly tested in production scenarios. You're welcome to try it though. The only difference is that you'll need to use a different material function in Unreal Engine that supports this layout, and you'll also need to feed that function the exact frame width reported by the bake tool. Also, the texture filtering should be set to nearest, and any frame interpolation will need to be handled manually if required. Alternatively, if the data is packed using the stack mode and the adjacent sub-mode, it gets stored in the immediate rows above or below. In this case, you'll need to enable the frame height option in the material function and provide the frame height as specified in the bake report. One thing to keep in mind, this packing mode prevents the use of texture interpolation for frame blending, so you'll likely want to enable nearest filtering in the texture settings. Frame interpolation can still be achieved manually by sampling the textures twice and interpolating the offset and normal using the frame remainder. The offset submode, which is the default, generally provides a smoother experience. In this mode, the rows are spaced apart, allowing UV scrolling to leverage pixel interpolation for frame blending. However, this scrolling needs to be constrained so that vertices only sample data within their designated range, avoiding bleed from other vertices data, if that makes sense. The offset values can also be remapped for storage in 8-bit RGBA textures, similar to how normals are typically handled. This introduces precision loss, which may or may not be acceptable depending on your use case and the level of fidelity you require. The benefit is that it cuts the offset texture's memory usage in half. Just make sure you use the appropriate material function and supply the offset and range values reported by the bake tool. Now, about normals, by default they are remapped from the -1 range into the 0-1 range. This, however, assumes that the normals actually fall within the -1 range, which statistically they should, especially as the vertex count increases. But you can choose to remap them based on their actual min-max range. In theory, this gives better precision, though in practice, to be honest, it's unlikely to make a visible difference. And for this reason, and because it requires a few extra steps, it's not enabled by default, but it's an option. And that's pretty much it, I think. Enjoy! If you have any question, let me know in the comments below, or contact me on my Discord server, or open a ticket on GitHub. The Git repository also comes with an extensive wiki that I really recommend you to read, especially before asking for help. Alright, cheers!